This has been delayed for a little while, a couple weeks at least. But the 3 weeks leading up to when I was originally going to teach, I'd been in the book of Job. I spent 2 weeks making my way through the book each day, and then the last week before I was going to teach, I spent studying, considering, praying, and thinking about what I wanted to share with you all this morning. And my intention this morning, it's a bit of an unconventional sort of teaching in that my intention is just to shine a light on the book of Job and hopefully give you all an interest and an excitement about what this book has to offer us. It's a very deep, a very profound, it's a literary masterpiece. We can't fully appreciate it not reading it in Hebrew, but I hope I can encourage us all to read it. And so I'm going to summarize it, but I actually decided to do something else a little unconventional, and I want to take a good chunk of time for us all to read the beginning, the introduction to the book. And I'll pause here and there to add some commentary, and and then after we read a decent chunk of the book, I'm going to be giving a condensed sort of rundown of the rest of the book, and then I'd like to give some reasons why the book of Job is so great, why you should read it, and how it points to Jesus. So let's pull out our Bibles. I think most of you already did, and turn to the first chapter of the book of Job. And I'll give a moment for a couple of you here. So Job chapter 1. I'm gonna read once everybody's ready. I'd like you to read along with me, and then I'm gonna pause at different moments to add a little commentary here and there. But mostly we're going to be reading through a decent chunk. I'll speak some on that and then come back around. But all right, I think that's enough time. So I'm going to start reading. Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Brief fact, interesting fact, Job being from the land of Uz, we know he's not an Israelite. Verse 2. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. I'm going to comment here. Now, something that's pretty cool about the book of Job is that he is making sacrifices for his children, and the context doesn't tell us how he would have known to do that, but we know that he's a true servant of God, and he's so concerned for his children, he's seeking God and sacrificing for them. And so leading into this next part, I wanted to say to pay attention because it's pretty cool that we're going to get a glimpse into the heavenly divine counsel of God. He's going to be dealing with angelic beings called the sons of God. So verse 6. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Satan here, I'm commenting again, is not a name. In the Hebrew, Hasatan, it means the adversary or the accuser. And it seems somewhat like we have a divine courtroom where God is calling his counsel and the prosecutor walks in, the accuser. Satan, at least in the book of Job, is not a proper name. And I was going to spend more time on this, but after some more looking into it, we can infer from the New Testament that this probably is Satan as we tend to think of it. In the book of Revelation, the accuser, Satan, the devil, and the serpent are all linked together. So it is likely that this is Satan as we think of him. But the book doesn't actually imply a proper name. It's the Satan, the accuser, the opposer, or the accuser. It's not a name. And I was going to camp out on that a little bit, but I think it's not. After more study, I think it's not as relevant to make that point, because I think the New Testament makes it fairly clear that this is Satan, as we tend to think of it. But the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So we see God just gave the Satan permission to take away everything Job has, but not to touch Job's body. And as this goes on, we will be pulled in to wrestle with God and why he would allow this to happen. Verse 13. There was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And I think it's important to pause here because, at least in this moment, it looks like Job is saying that God is doing evil, or that he is evil. Does anybody have a translation that reads differently? I'm reading the ESV. In verse 10, Job, halfway through, responds to his wife, says, "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin. And I was wondering if where it says evil, shall we not receive evil from God? If anybody's translation says anything different.
Mine says trouble.
Trouble?
Mine says,
Yep.
"Shall we not accept adversity?"
Adversity? Yeah, so adversity, trouble, evil. I thought it was important because I think I've been held up by this, and I think a lot of people could be going, God, shall we not receive evil from God? Like, God doesn't do evil. I think the NLT can be really helpful when reading Job and a lot of other Old Testament texts, but recognizing that though it may be easier to understand, that the NLT aims to translate in a way that communicates each thought, or where ESV or NASB are more of a word-for-word translation. But when reading Job, and I recommend reading Job to everyone, I think it can be good if you're able to have an NLT so that when you're, if anything is confusing, or looking at other translations too. It's good to look at other translations because, yeah, other translations can give extra perspective on what the book is saying. And let me see. So in investigating this part, think it's probably better translated as bad, trouble, adversity, or disaster. The only reason I see a problem in our modern English with the word evil here is that evil tends to always carry a moral connotation, that something is morally bad. But though it does sometimes mean morally bad or evil in the way we think of it, the Hebrew word ra, bad or evil translated, doesn't always mean morally evil. If a storm comes and a tree falls on your car or your house, that's something bad that happened. Or in Hebrew, it's something raw. It's not good, but it's not like the tree fell because the storm or the tree was doing something evil. And that's a little bit of a tangent, but I like to get in the book and investigate these things that challenge our perceptions of God and say, and that's a lot of what this book is things are going to be said about God, and we have to wrestle with, well, what is it saying exactly, and what does it mean? And that's why some of the translations say trouble, adversity, but
originally they were saying evil, right? Originally.
What are you saying?
Originally they said evil, and then it was I guess changed to like trouble and other stuff like that. But originally,
So yeah, the translation, they translated it trouble, adversity, um, because they're trying to, I think, avoid the word evil, because the moral implication of the word evil, at least in English, whereas the word in Hebrew doesn't always carry that moral connotation. So even in the book, I mean not the book, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it's the same word. It's the knowledge of good and bad, good and evil. Sometimes that word ra in Hebrew has the moral connotation of somebody's intentionally doing something wrong, sinful, evil, but it's not always that. So it's like the word bad, I think. If somebody does something bad, it can be evil and sinful, but it's something bad happens to us. It's not necessarily somebody did something evil to us. But that's a bit of a tangent that I wanted to pause on. But that's some of the fun things to investigate along the way as if you read Job. But now in okay, I'm going to get back into the text, sorry. This is verse 11 of chapter 2. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept. And they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So this is the end of what I'm calling the introduction to Job. And I do want to read chapter 3. It's pretty short, and it dives into what you can expect from most of the book of Job, which is actually, after the introduction here, it breaks into poetry. Poetic dialogue about God, suffering, and justice between Job and his friends. And it's deeply philosophical, theological, and emotional. Job's going on an emotional roller coaster through this. So I want to read chapter 3, so let's read it together. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning. Because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breast that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept, then I would have been at rest, with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together, they hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. So, this is the beginning of a challenging book, and I hope that you will continue on and read it. Something we should do every time we read the Bible, but is especially relevant in the book of Job, is to read it through the lens of Christ and to be on the lookout for pictures of Christ. Not just because it's fun and it's kind of like a scavenger hunt and you can find him in so many places, but because he is the key to really understanding the story. And because though it was written thousands of years before Christ, it is in so many ways pointing to Jesus Christ. The story has barely begun, and if we're looking, we can already see that we have a righteous man. The Bible says in the first chapter that he was righteous and blameless, and he's suffering greatly, though he doesn't deserve it, and God is allowing it for some reason. I think it's cool to notice so many correlations throughout the book. One example is when Job's friends can't even recognize him in his anguish and in his suffering. Just like Jesus was so broken, his friends couldn't recognize him. Job says, "Naked I came into this world, and naked I will return." And it makes us think of Jesus. He left the heavenlies and humbled himself to the ashes and dust of the earth, and he was stripped naked and suffered. I find it incredible, and it really stuck with me, that these friends of Job, though later in the book, they're actually kind of the bad guys for misrepresenting God and accusing Job. They actually started out seeming so strong and good. They wept with Job. They saw his anguish. They sat and they fasted with him for 7 days. Those seem like some legitimate friends. And still, we'll go on to see that his friends turn on him. His friends betray him. They thought he must deserve what was happening to him. And they had no framework to understand how Job could suffer so greatly and had done nothing wrong. They considered him punished by God and deserving of it, as did those who saw Jesus suffer and die. They thought surely Jesus must not have been who he said he was, or Job who he said he was, as Job constantly defends his righteousness. They couldn't understand why God would allow this to happen to him. Job is a foundational book that could have given Jesus' disciples and followers and the Jews of his time an insight into the plan and the nature and the justice of God. Just because someone suffers greatly and is greatly afflicted, and in Jesus' case was killed, doesn't mean that he deserved it or that he wasn't truly who he said he was. This book makes it very clear Job was a righteous, blameless man who did not deserve what was happening to him. This really gets us thinking and meditating on God and asking the hard questions about who God is, how he runs the world, what is justice. But what the book doesn't really do is come straight out and tell you all the answers. Instead, this book wants to tell you a story that takes you on a journey to wrestle with some of these most difficult questions And it's definitely what's been called meditation literature, meaning that you need to sit with it. You need to ponder over it and chew on it. Most of the book is filled with this dense poetry in the form of a back and forth dialogue about the nature of Job's suffering and arguments about God's justice and the way God runs the world. So an interesting point too is that you don't just want to pick up and open to a random page and start reading out of context. You don't want to do that with most any book in the Bible, but especially in Job, because Job may be saying something about God, or one of his friends may be saying something about God, and you don't actually know if what they're saying is true or not. There's actually a debate happening through the book. And you, as the reader, have to work through it along with Job and his friends until God shows up and has some words for Job towards the end of the book. I read chapter 3 because I want you to get a sense of where this book is going, but also a sense of the raw emotion and honesty of Job and his crying out to God. Throughout the book, Job is on a roller coaster of emotions between having a solid faith. Look at him at the beginning. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job had just lost everything. But he goes on this journey where he's then cursing the day he was born, wishing he was never born, intensely crying out, God, why is this happening to me? I wish that I never had to experience this. And he's pleading his case before God throughout the book. Though the whole Old Testament is pointing towards Jesus in different ways, Job was preparing the way and pointing to the true and ultimate Messiah being a righteous, suffering servant. And like so many people who were pictures of Christ, but failed or couldn't quite measure up, from Noah to Moses to David, Job also does stumble by accusing God and challenging God. But there's a beautiful ending. God responds, Job repents, and then when God's anger is burning against Job's friends for accusing Job and speaking wrongly about God, and this is towards the end, this is like right at the end of the book, Job is actually given the opportunity to intercede for his friends, between his friends and God. And God says, go to Job and I will hear the prayers of my servant Job. And God has mercy on Job's friends. What an incredible picture of Christ, that Job suffers undeservedly. He is rejected or betrayed, accused by his friends. And then God actually gives Job the opportunity, and Job turns around and intercedes for them, asking for their forgiveness from God. And God forgives them and listens because of the righteousness of Job. And though I feel like I jumped over this, let me see. I want to go back a little bit. I kind of jumped to the end because I was talking about how it reflects Jesus. But I want to go back a little bit and touch on when God answers Job. God's answer to Job is great, but it's kind of confusing, and it's not what we might expect. Because God doesn't really explain why Job is suffering or defend why Job is suffering. What I think is happening is that God doesn't try to explain and defend why he allowed this to happen. Instead, he tries to show Job that Job should trust him, even though he doesn't understand. That he is so far above Job, that Job can't even begin to understand what it's like to hold the whole universe together and to order it and to rule it by wisdom. And Job does humble himself. and he trusts. The difference between Job and Jesus is that Job didn't know why he was suffering. He was wrestling with God over it. And while Jesus knew what he was doing, he chose to suffer, and he fully trusted God. He fully submitted to God's wisdom, his plan. It wasn't easy. I think of the garden when Jesus is asking God if there's any other way. But ultimately, Jesus said, "Not my will, but yours be done." And that is the amazing trust that we need. That's the amazing trust that Jesus had. God questions Job in his answer. He says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And it's interesting to think of Jesus being the Word become flesh, that he was in the beginning, and all things were made by and through him. And it gives an incredible context to Jesus and his full trust and submission, that he fully understands, he fully knows God, that God doesn't have to come to Jesus and be like, "Where were you?" Like, challenge him and be like, this is just trust me. Jesus does fully trust God, and part of that is he is God. Part of that's he was there. He was in the beginning. He does fully know God. Through Christ, we are God's righteous servants. And Job is the original book that teaches us not to be surprised when the fiery trial comes. It teaches us to be prepared to suffer for righteousness' sake. It's actually Job's righteousness that in a way brings his suffering. He was singled out because of his righteousness. God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" I think of the verse, Satan is prowling around like a lion seeking someone to devour. And he tells God, "Oh, I've been wandering to and fro on the earth." And God goes, "Oh, have you considered my servant Job?" He's a righteous man. And it's actually, that's something we have to wrestle with too. Why did God point out Job and be like, "Oh, go after him"? But it's actually Job's righteousness that brought about his suffering. It tells us to trust God's wisdom, that his ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. And we can trust his plan and purpose and his goodness. And that if we endure to the end, we can have hope that there is a reward, an inheritance, there's blessing, and there's life. And we see that in the end of the story, Job is restored, double everything that he had. And he had already been the richest, most blessed man in the East, it said. And God restored doubled everything he had and more as a gift from God. The book of Job shows us that even if we did everything right, which we don't, God may bring suffering. And we can not only wrestle with it and bring our struggle to God, we can be honest with him. We can really pour out our heart to him. Job is a perfect example. You see, he's laying out his raw emotions. He's bringing it to God. He's wrestling with God. And God answers. And we can make it through. And we can trust him. So let us, as Paul says, suffer for righteousness' sake. Let us not be surprised when the suffering and trials come. Let us cry out to God, seek him in the storm. Let us ultimately rest in him and trust. Let us know that Jesus fully passed the test. And like Job, he is interceding and praying for us. And God loves us and will have mercy on us because of his righteous servant, Jesus Christ. So that is my pitch for you to hopefully read Job. I know I gave my perspective on a lot of the ending and how it reflects Christ, but there's so much more to be mined. And I kind of gave you the intro and I kind of gave you the end, but there's some really great the meat of the center of the book. There's a really great wrestling dialogue between him and his friends, and then somebody else comes in uh, towards the end too that has another perspective. So you have a great dialogue going on that I found personally um, was really helpful. It was really um, a blessing, and I read it over 2 weeks. So it was a great journey of to be on that journey with Job, trying to understand and it makes us question our different ideas we have about God, and it brings even a balance in a sense to the other wisdom literature of the Bible. There's the Proverbs that a lot of the Proverbs do give us the impression the righteous will be blessed, the wicked will be punished. And Job gives us a framework for that's not always exactly how God runs everything. Tit for tat, you do something good, you do something bad, there's going to be blessing or there's going to be um, punishment. But that's all I have for you this morning, and I'm going to pray for us all. Lord, thank you that you come to us. You offer us truth, you offer us wisdom, you offer us a relationship, and that we can trust in you. Thank you for your word, that we can dive in, that we can explore, that we can learn, that we can grow closer to you,